She had no weapon and no map and no plan beyond the desperate will to survive, and yet in that frozen moment, standing at the edge of the barbed wire fence with searchlights cutting through the darkness above her, she made a decision that would echo through history and define the very meaning of human courage. Because in the winter of 1943, deep within occupied Poland, a woman whose name had been erased from every official record was about to do something that military strategists would later call impossible. Her name was Witold Pilecki's wife, Zofia, and while history would remember her husband as the man who voluntarily entered Auschwitz, she herself faced a trial that few have ever spoken about, because she was captured during an underground resistance operation and taken, not to a concentration camp, but to a prisoner of war facility where the Germans held women they suspected of partisan activities. But what happened next changed everything, because Zofia was not the woman the Germans thought she was, and she carried inside her mind intelligence that could turn the tide of the entire Eastern Front. The camp sat in a valley, surrounded by dense forest, and the guards had grown complacent, believing that no woman could survive the wilderness alone in the dead of winter, and they were almost right, because the temperature had dropped to -20 degrees and the snow lay 3 feet deep across the frozen landscape. And yet, Zofia had spent her childhood in these very forests, learning from her grandmother the old ways of survival that predated modern warfare by centuries. The sound of boots on frozen ground echoed through the night as guards patrolled the perimeter, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked and the searchlight swept across the yard, illuminating the faces of women huddled together for warmth in the wooden barracks, and Zofia lay among them, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each pass of the light. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because 3 weeks earlier, she had been living what passed for a normal life in occupied Warsaw, working as a nurse by day and running messages for the resistance by night. And she had been careful, so careful, but someone had talked, and now she found herself in this place where women disappeared and were never seen again. The first days in the camp had broken something inside her as she watched the brutality unfold and heard the screams that punctuated the night, and saw women she had known reduced to shadows of themselves. But somewhere in that darkness a flame refused to die, and it whispered to her that giving up was not an option and that her story was not yet finished. And then something no one expected happened on the coldest night of January, when a new prisoner arrived and was thrown into Zofia's barracks. And this woman, who called herself Maria but whose real name was Helena, carried information from the outside world, and what she told Zofia, in hushed whispers, changed the calculation entirely, because the Soviets were advancing and the Germans were preparing to evacuate the camp, and when they did, they would leave no witnesses behind. The clock was now ticking, and Zofia understood that her window of opportunity was measured not in weeks, but in days, and possibly hours. And she began to study the camp with new eyes, memorizing the patrol patterns and noting the weak points in the fence, and watching which guards drank too much and which ones fell asleep at their posts. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because beneath the floorboards of the old storage shed lay a tunnel that previous prisoners had started digging before they were discovered and executed. And the Germans believed they had sealed it forever, but Zofia found the entrance hidden beneath a pile of frozen debris, and she knew that this forgotten passage might be her only chance. Night after night she worked in silence, scraping at the frozen earth with her bare hands, and a broken spoon in her fingers bled, and her nails cracked. But she did not stop, because stopping meant death, and she had promised herself that she would see her children again. And that promise was stronger than any pain. The tunnel extended 30 feet, and she needed it to go at least 50 more to clear the fence and the frozen ground and the guard tower. But she was running out of time, because the sounds of distant artillery grew louder each night, and the guards grew more nervous and more cruel, and Zofia knew that when the order came to evacuate, they would not hesitate to destroy everything and everyone. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because hidden in the camp records, which she accessed by seducing a young clerk with promises of safe passage west, were documents detailing not just prisoner lists, but the locations of mass graves and the names of collaborators and the routes used to transport stolen treasures from museums across Europe. She memorized everything, because paper could be confiscated, but her mind was a vault that no one could unlock, and she repeated the information to herself each night as she dug, creating a rhythm of facts and figures that kept her focused and kept the despair at bay. The escape would happen on February 7th, because that night a winter storm was predicted, and the visibility would drop to nothing, and the guards would huddle in their towers, drinking schnapps to stay warm and complaining about the cold, and they would never see her slip through the shadows. But Zofia had faced an impossible choice, because Helena was too weak to make the journey, and leaving her behind meant leaving her to certain death, but taking her meant risking everything, and possibly condemning them both. And in that moment Zofia understood what true courage really meant, because it was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She chose to take Helena because she could not live with herself if she abandoned a friend, and together they crawled through the tunnel as the storm raged above them and the frozen earth pressed against their bodies, and their breath came in ragged gasps, and their hearts pounded so loudly they were certain the guards would hear. The tunnel ended just beyond the outer fence, and they emerged into a world of white and wind and chaos. And for a moment Zofia could not see anything but snow and darkness, and she felt Helena's hand grip hers, and together they ran toward the tree line, knowing that every second counted, and that the guards might discover their absence at any moment. The forest swallowed them whole, and the snow covered their tracks almost as fast as they made them. And Zofia led Helena through the wilderness using skills her grandmother had taught her decades ago, following the moss on the trees and the direction of the wind and the memory of maps she had studied in another lifetime. For 7 days they traveled through the frozen landscape, eating bark and melted snow and sleeping in hollowed trees, and their bodies grew weaker, but their spirits remained unbroken because each step took them further from the camp and closer to freedom. And Zofia whispered stories to Helena, to keep her conscious stories of the life they would build when the war was over. On the 8th day they heard voices speaking Russian, and Zofia's heart leaped because she knew they had reached the advancing Soviet lines. She called out in the Russian she had learned from her grandmother, and soldiers emerged from the trees and looked at these two skeletal women with disbelief and wonder. The intelligence Zofia carried in her mind proved invaluable to the Allied forces because the locations of mass graves helped build the case for war crimes tribunals, and the names of collaborators led to arrests across 3 countries, and the transport routes revealed treasures that were eventually returned to their rightful owners. But Zofia never sought recognition for what she had done, because for her the greatest reward was simply surviving and being reunited with her children, who had been hidden with relatives in the countryside. And when she held them again for the first time in 18 months, she wept tears that contained all the fear and hope and determination that had carried her through the darkness. Helena recovered from her ordeal and went on to become a teacher, who spent the rest of her life telling students about the woman who refused to leave her behind, and together they testified at the Nuremberg trials, providing evidence that helped convict some of the most notorious war criminals in history. The camp where they had been held was liberated by Soviet forces just 3 days after their escape, and the soldiers found evidence that the Germans had planned to execute all remaining prisoners before retreating, and Zofia's timing had been not just lucky but miraculous. After the war, Zofia returned to nursing and raised her children in a small apartment in Warsaw, and she rarely spoke about what she had endured because the memories were too painful, and because she believed that survival was not about glory but about quiet persistence and everyday courage. She lived to see Poland free again, watching the fall of communism in 1999 with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, and when journalists asked her about her wartime experiences, she simply smiled and said that she had done what any mother would do, and that the real heroes were those who did not come home. Zofia had passed away in 1994, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and on her gravestone there is no mention of her escape or her bravery. Just a simple inscription that reads, "Beloved Mother and Grandmother," because that was how she wanted to be remembered. But those who knew her story passed it down through generations, and today, her great-granddaughter runs a foundation that helps women escaping conflict zones around the world. And the legacy of one woman's courage continues to save lives, decades after her death. Her story reminds us that courage is not measured in medals or monuments, but in the quiet decisions made in moments of absolute darkness, when giving up would be so much easier than going on, and yet something inside refuses to surrender. She escaped with nothing but her courage and a will to survive, and she proved that even in the darkest chapters of human history, the light of the human spirit cannot be extinguished, because it burns brightest precisely when the darkness is most complete. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of her life. Not that she escaped, but that she chose to take Helena with her. Because true courage is never just about saving yourself, about refusing to abandon others, even when doing so puts everything at risk. In the end, Zofia's story is not just a tale of escape, but a testament to the extraordinary strength that ordinary women possess when everything they love is on the line. Because she was not trained as a soldier or a spy, she was simply a mother who refused to let the darkness win. And that is why her story matters, because it proves that heroes do not always wear uniforms and victories are not always won on battlefields. And sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in frozen tunnels, dug with bleeding fingers by women whose names history nearly forgot. She walked through the fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, and her story will continue to inspire generations long after the last witness, too. That terrible war has passed because courage like hers does not die. It transforms and multiplies and spreads, like light in the darkness, until even the deepest shadows cannot hold it back.